Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Ashley Okwuosa, and I'm a journalist. The title of today's panel is Her Frame Matters, Depiction of Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Women of Color in Canadian Screen Content. We have a really incredible panel here today, and I'm so excited to introduce everyone. We'll start with Dr. Selina Mudavanhu. Selina Mudavanhu is assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies and Multimedia at McMaster University. She holds a PhD in media studies from the Center for Film and Media Studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Selina's research interests are in critical media studies, critical race studies, decolonial studies, social media and the politics of representation and framing, media audiences, and digital storytelling. Her current research focuses on understanding the ways those with power constitute meanings around race and other intersecting identities in mainstream media and social media texts. A large portion of this research examines the likely implications of the dominant constructions on the lives of ordinary people. Selina's research also prioritizes the voices of the subaltern. Selina is interested in the manner ordinary people speak back to power, articulate their experiences, and create alternative meanings on social media platforms and through methodologies such as digital storytelling. Welcome, Selina.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Dilyana Mincheva is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies and Multimedia at McMaster University. Her most recent research is engaged with the culturological study of religious iconoclasm, the politics of image in cinematic terrorism and utopia. She's the bearer of 2 international awards for research excellence granted by the Journal of Religion and Spirituality in Society, and the author of the monograph, The Politics of Western Muslim Intellectual Discourse in the West, which is published by Sussex Academic Press in 2016. Welcome, Dilyana.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We also have Clementine Oberst. Clementine is a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication Studies and Media Arts at McMaster University. She's also completing a diploma in gender and social justice with a background in cultural studies and film and television studies. Clementine specializes in screen studies and is particularly interested in the rhetorical, aesthetic, and ideological strategies of reality television. Her PhD thesis project looks at the docu-soap genre of reality television through an intersectional feminist lens informed by theories of queerness, race, class, and disability. Her research projects all consider how popular culture reflects real-world political, social, and cultural ideologies. Welcome, Clementine.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
And then we have Salami. Salami is an MA student in the Communications and New Media program at McMaster University. Her research focuses on media studies and encompasses African feminism, Nigerian feminism, and womanism. Welcome, Simi.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm really excited to have everyone here and to really get started on this really important conversation. The first question I have, I'll just throw it out, and everyone should please feel free to contribute, but it's more of a general question. How would you categorize the ways Black, Indigenous, Asian, and women of color are being represented in the Canadian screen-based industry?
Maybe I can start the conversation.
Please, yes.
I'm sure that my colleagues here have more to add, but since this has been very important questions for us, and I had the honor of teaching screen industries, specifically television, to undergraduate students this semester at McMaster University. We spent considerable time in class trying to understand Canadian representations of marginalized groups and their histories and what needs to be changed. So I would like to mention 3 important reports in terms of recent research that tries to understand marginalized groups and how they're represented on screen. So one report comes from Kathleen Newman-Bremang, who wrote in 2019 a groundbreaking article, Canadian Television So White. And she particularly pays attention to representation on Canadian screen industries in the period between 2017 and 2019, but also she gives us like a long-durable perspective on what is missing from Canadian screens. Then another very important report is from a think tank organization and it's called Women in View. It's released in 2021, and it looks at Canadian screen representations in the same period, 2017 to 2019. And then we have a very important Black Screen Office report, led by John Jenkinson and Jen Holness. The report is called Being Seen, and it's released in 2022, and it also describes absences from the Canadian screen industries. So basically, all of those research findings, even though they go in different directions, they're absolutely unanimously agreeing on the fact that marginalized groups, specifically Black women, Asian women, Indigenous women, are largely missing from the stories that have been told in Canadian screen industries for a long time. And even though things are changing, particularly in 2019, so in 2019, we can see more openness towards diverse stories. Still, there is a consensus that very small amount of representation has been allocated to Black women and women of color, and to Indigenous women specifically, and Asian women. This is important because, first of all, it does not correlate with the demographic numbers in Canadian society, so it does not represent accurately Canadian diversity. And because the kind of stories that have been told have not been owned by these communities. So just in terms of, I guess, statistics, and I'll leave it here, like in 2019, all reports tell us, although nearly half of all TV directors were women, only 12 were Black women and women of color, 12% of those, and less than 1% were Indigenous women. In the same year, women wrote 57% of TV episodes, but fewer than 5% were written by Black women and women of color, and fewer than 2% by Indigenous women. So we start, of course, the conversation with numbers, but we're going to gradually say why those numbers matter, and why we have to take representation seriously, and the consequences of representation. But I'll just leave it here.
Thank you so much for that, Dilyana. And I'd love for anyone to also add their perspective to that question, and maybe kind of shed light on the numbers that Dilyana mentioned, and maybe why there seem to be so little, why there are so many racialized women in this space. What are some of the barriers that exist?
Maybe I can speak a little bit about this. They have a diversity report in Canada, and the CRCC receives that diversity reports. But the problem is those diversity reports are not analyzed, and they don't go any further than just reporting the amount of people they hire for diversity and inclusion. And a lot of the times, diversity and inclusion is more of like a smoke screen that exists to assuage certain certain tensions, and give the illusion that this is being taken into account, and in reality it is not. And the diversity reports kind of need to be analyzed a lot more and taken a step further.
Thank you for that, Selina.
I can add a little bit onto that. So if we kind of look at the context, we do have this multiculturalism policy that is supposed to be guiding what we see on screen, but oftentimes what happens is that the implementation is not very good. The definitions are a little bit hazy of what counts as diverse or multicultural content. This is also complicated by the fact that content is produced in 2 languages in Canada, and those different linguistic communities can differ quite a bit in the types of representations they're giving. And we're also coming at it from this perspective of the ideal of multiculturalism and what that means for Canada's national identity and what it actually means in practice. So yeah, I think Simi was very right in saying that this, the visuals of diversity can be used to conceal what is happening behind the scenes, what the types of representations we're seeing are actually doing. So this makes me think of some work by Ronaldo Walcott about multiculturalism, where he sort of talks about how multiculturalism in Canada is a way that the state can neutralize what it understands as a threat from racial and cultural minorities by like making those things apolitical. So I think a lot of the time what we're seeing is these multicultural diverse identities, when we do see them, they are sort of viewed as apolitical. We're seeing women of color, especially in supporting roles, but we're not really getting to explore their experiences, what it means to have that particular positionality. And it is changing a little bit, but I think there's just such a small amount of that representation that it's definitely not enough at this point. And yeah, it's coming from this context of sort of multiculturalism as something that you can see, but something that maybe is not being engaged with in a deeper way to really tell people's stories in a way that feels authentic to a variety of lived experiences.
Another question I wanted to follow up on, it's a relatively obvious question, and Dilyana, you alluded to this in your answer to the first one, but I guess I want to ask why do you all think it's important that the Canadian screen-based industry takes matters of representation so seriously? Dilyana, you mentioned that one thing is that, you know, when you don't have as many racialized women in these positions, it doesn't reflect the diversity of Canada. So I wanted to know if everyone can kind of share their opinion on why this is an important thing for the industry to take seriously.
I'll go for that. So I want to draw attention to a now dated theory called the cultivation theory by a fellow called George Gebner. So he theorized in the 60s, and he was talking about television. And his main argument is that long-term exposure to television content, to whatever ideas about different people affects worldviews, affects the ways in which the society, the culture views certain groups of people. And he was really almost speaking back to this idea of, television having immediate short-term effects. So if you think about the ways in which, we are exposed to, content on our screens on an ongoing basis, I think we need to pay special attention at the kinds of ideas that are being normalized that form the worldviews in society. And I think worldviews are important to take into consideration, because if you only ever see Black people on screen and you never have friends who are Black or interact with Black people, your only ideas about that group of people is mediated through the media. And so that's a huge problem, because if there are stereotypes in there about, for example, Black people being lazy, Black people not being smart, it more or likely leads to discrimination. And importantly, for the self, if you don't see yourself represented on screen, if you're missing, if you are represented in these problematic stereotypical ways, I think it affects your self-esteem, your confidence. It robs people of their dignity. So I think we need to care about representations, because they have these real life consequences for people in real life. So it's not a discursive question, or it's not something that's theoretical. It literally translates to, how embodied Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, racialized bodies experience the world and the ways in which they are treated by the world.
Thank you so much for that, Selina.
I would like to add to what my colleague has just mentioned. Representation is extremely important part of our understanding of media and of studying media. And it's also one of the most complex phenomena in media studies. Certainly, representation is important because, as my colleague said, it reflects stereotypes, it reflects understanding, deeply embodied, deeply mediated understandings of the world. But also I'll go into another theory that we often represent in front of our students, this is the so-called agenda setting of media. And very often media, particularly mass media that are consumed by large scale of people, like large amount of audiences, they have this ability to set conversations and to transmit conversations well beyond like a limited circle of people. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to care deeply about representations, because stereotypical representations of course have deep societal effects. At the same time, I would say that representation is very complex because representation is always mediated and it cannot ever fully coincide with the world. Like representation is always a matter of somebody's angle, somebody's frame, somebody's vision, and it can never fully coincide with reality. So we always have to kind of keep in mind that the politics of representation is an artifice that's created by people, even when the aspiration is for the most authentic, the most comprehensive representation. So it's very important that we have multiplicities of perspectives and as many voices as possible, given equal and equitable access to being heard and being transmitted, so that, you know, the real multiplicity of the world gets mediated.
I just want to add one thing, a point of clarity. I think what we are arguing, Dilyana and I, is not that the media is all powerful, that it has these unidirectional effects on passive people. Of course, people do have agency, but I think there've been studies, enough studies that actually do talk about the agenda setting role of the media that my colleague was talking about. And so while there is this kind of pushback against, you know, overly glorifying the power of the media in terms of selecting ideas and making some salient foregrounding and backgrounding ideas as if people, you know, are passive. I think people are indeed not passive, but as I mentioned, I think we would not be doing, you know, a good job if we did not, you know, talk about the ways in which, you know, the media truly sets the agenda, cultivates worldviews and perspectives and ways of seeing and ways of being human.
Thank you both for raising that, because it leads to the other question I wanted to ask, because all of you on this panel bring such an interesting perspective, bring an academic perspective, you know, to how you view and interact with media or its effects. And I wanted to know that for people without that critical training, for people like myself, journalists, people who are watching this, I'm wondering what are some of the ways that all of you can kind of suggest that we critically engage with content, you know, media about diverse communities? What metrics should we be using to see if they're meeting the mark, really?
I'll take the opportunity to kind of open the conversation here. I'm sure that we can expand that. It's very interesting that you mentioned metrics, because right now we live in an extremely complicated media environment. So if in the beginning of the 60s and 70s, when, for example, television developed as a media, we had a few channels that were advertisement driven and audiences kind of were aggregated around that. So it was really the period when media could set an agenda, because you have linear schedules and people sitting in front of a TV set with their families and talking about the content the next day with their colleagues, the so-called water cooler conversation. Right now, 40 years later, we live in an extremely complicated media space where it's almost impossible to measure audience engagement, and it's almost impossible to kind of come up with a unified metrical system that tells us what kind of televisual or film products become mass products or products of mass culture. So we know for a fact that streaming services, specifically Netflix, the original series that Netflix creates, they pay specific attention to representation and like giving voices to marginalized communities. They also spent a lot of licensing dollars to international content, bringing it into very rich libraries and catalogs for international consumption. But Netflix, for example, is one of those streaming giants that does not release enough data for us to know exactly how many people are watching what kind of content. Rather than the centralized media system from the past, where we have a few channels with mass audiences and unified televisual products, right now we're talking in media studies about niche content and taste communities, where, you know, an ultra niche taste group can congregate around a specific TV show, and they can push this into fandom, and they can generate cultural conversations. So unlike in the past, where we basically need one TV show to generate ripples across like the society, right now we have small productions that target small audiences or much smaller audiences, but they can potentially drive important conversations, and this changes the games of cultural capital and cultural power that televisual productions have. So this is my 2 cents, and I'll continue later.
I think what Dr. Dilyana was talking about is very, very important because it is actually such a complex mediascape that we are in currently. And I think an important question to ask yourself when you're engaging with media critically is whose purpose is being served. And that might be a bit of a complex conversation to start approaching, but it leads to questions of who funded the production, like what Dr. Dilyana was just talking about. Who funded the production? What is their objective? What history do they have? And it allows the average consumer to just engage more critically with the media they're consuming, start to criticize or critically think about the stereotypes that are being presented, how certain racialized bodies are being presented and constructed. And if they start to engage with things like that, and especially in the mediascape that we're in right now, I think that would be the first step in really dismantling a lot of the dominant worldviews that we have about certain racialized bodies. And yeah, I think that's a good step to start from.
Just to also add to what Dilyana and Simi have said, I think another way of developing these critical thinking skills. So if I'm looking at representations of race, of Black people, I ask myself, what other experiences of Blackness am I not seeing? Am I not seeing being represented there? Do my experiences, are they being represented here? Is my totality as a human being being represented? So beginning to question and to see what is absent, what is not obvious and on the screen, in addition to critically engaging with what is being shown, I think you can draw on lived experiences to begin to imagine those ideas and ways of being human that have been erased and that are not on screen. And I think for people, for example, if you're not a Black person and you're engaging with these texts that, are about Black people, I think partly is looking at what have I read? What have I learned? If you are in university, what courses have I taken? There are courses on critical race studies, for example. What have I learned that kind of goes against what I'm being shown here? So what ordinary people, we do it every day. These critical thinking skills are not, something that is way out there. We already do it. So it's just bringing it to what we are seeing, being skeptical, having these conversations with yourself and with others. Is this the full totality of what I'm being shown? Because the danger is most of these stories, some of these stories, they leave out other realities about the people they are representing. So having that questioning mind, I think, is useful for anyone to kind of adopt when they're engaging with representations.
I definitely echo that, Selina, that you don't need to be someone with a strong academic background to be able to engage in these questions and to critically consider what you are being shown in terms of representational politics. And I think, yeah, considering what you're not seeing is a really major component to this, to being, I guess, more media literate and thinking through what you're being seen and what it is doing. And I would say the other thing is just to not just stop at seeing that someone is represented, but to really consider what that representation is doing, what message it's sending, what it's saying about a group or an individual. And I also encourage people to think about not just what you're seeing on screen, but what is happening behind the scenes as well. So who is writing a character, who is directing this show or movie, and going higher up, like who's funding it, who is high up at these organizations, because that could really tell you a lot. Not just what you are directly seeing on screen.
Thank you so much for that. I also, it seems like we might all be noticing as consumers of media that self-funded and self-produced stories about racialized women are becoming more commonplace. There are a few popular ones in the US and some more recent ones here in Canada. So I guess this is a question for everyone, but how has social media and access to the internet changed the way that women from underrepresented communities are either creating content about themselves or generally engaging with content about themselves?
I can go for it. I think although we do know that social media is not, this platform made out of a good heart charity, it's not. It has real capitalist intentions, and the bottom line is important. Somebody needs to make profit by selling other people's ideas and worldviews to somebody. We do know that, but I think ordinary people are almost appropriating these platforms and using them in very, very creative ways, and in ways that probably it happened prior to social media, but it wasn't as visible as it is, because now, everyone almost has a Facebook account, a Twitter account, or Instagram. And so I think the existence of social media has provided opportunities, although, as we said, in the context of this neoliberal capitalist, machinery, it has provided opportunities for voices to be heard, for voices that normally are not centralized to be centralized. So you actually don't need communication studies or journalism degree to be a content producer. You just need a story and a voice, and you say it and you tell it, and there is no mediation. Well, there is kind of mediation, right? When you post something and maybe somebody reports you to Facebook and they take it out, but it's almost a space where you can get away with, putting your thoughts and ideas out there. And if you create a blog, for example, you can tell all the stories that you want about yourself, at different moments in time. The only challenge with, ordinary people having this, unbridled access to tell their own stories, the only almost drawback, if I can say, I think generally it's a positive development. I think, communication should be democratized. The more voices telling your story should be celebrated. But if you consider ethics around storytelling, ethics around telling other people's stories, if you're not formally trained in, communication studies and journalism, those kind of fall on the wayside. And so what ends up happening is, you have sometimes content that should not be in the public space, and maybe images of friends that did not consent to be, posted. And so I think it is good, but at the same time, I think we also need to look at almost this parallel underbelly of the ability of having, platforms to communicate and to articulate your stories in your own voice.
I'm going to jump here as well. I really enthusiastically agree and support everything that my colleague Dr. Mudavanhu has said, and I would like to just offer a perspective from my more recent research, where I particularly research Muslim feminism and Muslim women on social media platforms, and the way in which they're trying to break away from stereotypical Islamophobic representations of, their agency, but also to break away from patriarchal structures within their own communities that also limit their agency. And it has been extremely interesting to observe through social media the storytelling of women from Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Canadian Muslim women, American Muslim women, and how the projects kind of meet and clash and enter into various exciting dialogues around identity and agency. So to kind of answer that question, what do social media contribute? I would say very much agreeing deeply with Selina that there's a capitalistic enterprise and machinery that kind of controls through algorithmic ordering whose voices get the most likes and they get the most transmission. But at the same time, almost simultaneously and against that trend is multiplicity of voices that wait to be discovered on YouTube, on Twitter, and to kind of hit against various axes of oppression and stigmatization. And I observed that in my own research, particularly trying to understand and catalog and give voice to Muslim women's agency. So I find that very exciting.
I also want to add on, in terms of the context we're in this really intense version of what Henry Jenkins calls convergence culture, where basically all these different media systems are kind of collapsing into one. So when we look at TV, for example, we can watch a movie on TV instead of going to the movie theater. And we're in this strange era where there's all these streaming services, so it's not the same thing as broadcast TV where you have to watch everything at a specific time and the schedule is set by someone else and out of your control. So then there's all these questions about what even is TV anymore. Are web series, does that count as television? And we're getting this really intense feedback loop too, where users are sharing their thoughts on what they're watching on social media to an extent that we never before saw. So we can publicly see people's responses to different media. And I think that does change in maybe small and maybe slow ways how different groups are represented, or at least put pressure on producers to create more representation and more types of representation. And I do think that the online web series, there's been an explosion of those recently too, and some of them only ever stay online, but you do get those breakout ones. Issa Rae's Insecure started as a super low budget YouTube series, and now it's one of the biggest shows on HBO. So I think that we're going to be seeing more and more of that, and whether people want to move that to a traditional media ecosystem where there's a bigger budget, but they may be bound by more rules, or whether they just want to keep producing their own thing, low budget, but they have total creative control. I think we're going to be seeing more of that, especially with underrepresented groups, that it's harder for them to break into a traditional media setting. And with web series and social media content, all you really need is an iPhone and an internet connection. So I think that does open things up a little bit more.
So we, I guess, all of you kind of alluded to this earlier, but when we talked about the stereotypical representations, of women from marginalized groups, I wanted to kind of, again, bring that back to the forefront and ask all of you, what are some of the real life implications of some of this? Some of these representations. I think, Selina, you mentioned this, and Dilyana, you also talked about this earlier, but if you can kind of share examples or what that looks like when these stereotypes kind of go from the screen to help then people kind of interact with, women from marginalized communities in real life?
Well, I'll go and maybe I'll return to that later as well. So, of course, one of the biggest harms that like media scholars have documented is that when people do not see themselves reflected on screens, they just don't engage. They don't become part of the audience. They become skeptical or cynical towards all media content. So that's one very direct consequences. And again, with social media and streaming, we have like distinct desire of various diverse voices to get their story told in their own terms. So that's one direct consequence. We need people to feel reflected on the screen. Storytelling is a powerful cultural capital, and it does matter who tells the story and how the story is told, and who are the people who produce those stories. And I have to say that, like, because we're talking about Canada, things are like gradually changing. In Canada, we have the Black Screen Office. They're doing extremely exciting work to kind of, on the one hand, really give voice to Black communities and like complex, deep, authentic Black representation. And on the other hand, to just generally address diversity in Canada in the most complex way possible. And like part of their research, I just want to briefly mention that they have kind of highlighted the TV shows both in French and film both in French and in English, and among them are like currently produced TV shows Eva Kabulia, Amour d'Occasion, Sci-Fi in French, and the story is based in Montreal. Aubrey Nealon and Arnold Pinnock, Bruce Ramsey story The Porter, which is the first of its kind story looking at Black unions, like one based in Chicago and one based in Montreal. So they're going back to the history of Canadian slavery and trying to talk about Black agency and how like the Black Canadian identity had to fight against white supremacy, but also Black joy and Black love. Extremely interesting show, and I really recommend it to anyone. I should also mention another sci-fi production, which is sci-fi and comedy, Overlord and the Underworlds, done by Anthony Farrell and Ryan Wiesbrock. We have the amazing work of Renata Lopez and Georgina Lopez with the fabulous show with Faye and Fluffy, which is a kids show and kind of takes a queer perspective and like centers queer voices. We also have The Coroner, which is a multicultural project in the sense that Clementine mentioned, but it really centers Black agency, and it has like really a lot of deep attention to Black representation. Eric Piccoli's Je voudrais qu'on me fasse, very successful drama, which again centers multicultural Canada and new and exciting ways. So I guess my point is there are a lot of exciting things that are being done at the moment, and they're here to kind of remedy some of the lacks. Because when it comes to Canada, we're really looking at a deep lack. Like when we go to American television, we can say, you know, Americans have done like stereotypical representation quite a lot, but they have production that centers specifically Black people since the 1970s. So we're looking at a much longer tradition of Black representation and much more intense debates in America, in the States, compared to what's happening in Canada. And we can go into details, like Herman Gray, for example, who is a Black American media scholar, would say that, you know, within the States, there are at least 3 ways in which representation of Black people and race has been done in the long history of representation. We have assimilationist perspectives where, you know, the idea is universal harmony, and like colorblind representation. Then you have another representation, which is a pluralist, where you have people of separate races moving in the world separately, but here you have basically the white heterosexual family standard centered as the standard for the Black family. And then we have multiculturalist productions in the States where diversity and like really critical race reflection is centered. And this is the history of American television, but Canada is largely lacking in terms of these debates. So when we look at Canadian representation, we have recently again Kim's Convenience, we have Dickstown centering Vanessa Antoine for the first Black lead in Canadian television. But in the long history of Canadian productions, Black voices are largely missing. So to a certain extent, we need to catch up with certain debates that have been happening in media studies as well around what is accurate representation. And those debates have been happening in the States. And the final thing that I'm going to say here is that Canada has to pay attention to representation and storytelling, because a lot of Black Canadian talent is migrating to the States. Vanessa Antoine, for example, is currently working in LA and doing film and TV productions in LA. So Canada loses talent. And that's another direct consequence of, not paying attention to representation. I'll stop here.
Another question I want to ask is that we've talked a lot about representation just in terms of the number of racialized women we see on the screen. But another question I want to ask is that I guess when we talk about representation, can we move it not only to talk about, the number of people we see on the screen or the types of people we see on the screen, but also the stories that are told about, these communities themselves. And I guess I'm wondering if that's something that, you all can talk a little bit about. Yeah.
Well, I can start because I'm definitely very interested in this question. And I think that particularly when you have a group that is underrepresented in general, each representation that we see carries more representational weight because there's not a lot of other representations to add to the diversity of that group. So even if we just look at, for example, how Indigenous women are portrayed on television, if there aren't very many of those representations, then we're not seeing a broad variety of experiences that Indigenous women can face. So I think part of it is to increase the amount of representations, but we also want to think about what types of representations we're seeing. So greater diversity in class and sexuality and disability and family and jobs, all of that is very important. And I think that that is a major facet of an intersectional lens. Everybody has multiple facets of their identity that work together, and we can't just reduce people to one quality. So when we say we want to increase representation, it means that we want to be able to see diversity within one aspect of a group that we identify.
Sorry, just to echo Clementine's point, absolutely, the diversity in stories, even within marginalized communities, is not as present. And I'm thinking of the show Working Moms, which is a CBC show, and the Black women that are represented, that are middle class, that are higher class, and it kind of subscribes to a very white feminist girl boss ideal where she's rich, she has all this access, and her race is kind of an afterthought, and it's barely even engaged with, and she's just kind of plopped on the screen this is part of what we're talking about. And Working Moms is on, I think, season 3 right now, and it took them that long to present a proper Black character. The other Black character they had was a racialized person, and I think they were African as well, and they barely gave her any screen time. And by the time they were able to really engage with a character that was not white, they made her to Western ideals. She was girl bossy, she was very powerful, and she didn't have an accent, and she didn't have an accent outside of the Canadian accent. And I think that needs to be interrogated a lot more, because the working class is not really represented in that way, and people on the lower class, and even if they are, it's very negative representations. I'm thinking of Scarborough, but maybe that's not necessarily television. But yeah.
Thank you for that, Simi. I'm gonna see if anyone else has anything to add before I move on to my next question.
So just to echo what everyone else has said, brilliant points. And I think if you think about Blackness in Canada, it's very diverse. Blackness looks so different. It's not just this one homogeneous thing. Everybody knows that, right? But how come when it comes to telling stories, you only have stories like Simi was talking about, and there's a neglect of what Clementine was talking about, this intersectional experience of, you know, a diverse range of people within, if you're thinking about Black people, you know, a whole well-rounded, many experiences, many stories. So I think just recognizing that, you know, groups are not homogeneous, like Blackness in Canada is not homogeneous. And within that group, if you're thinking of African migrants, they are not also homogeneous. You get migrants coming from French-speaking Africa, you have migrants from English-speaking Africa. So within that, so you can tell stories for years and years and years, and you will not be able to run out if you think about it. So it's actually just, you know, expanding the way in which you see people and recognize that, you know, there are many interesting and different stories that exist to be told.
Yeah, can I just add quickly here as well? The same is true for like almost any marginalized group. Like, again, to go back to my earlier example with Muslim women, again, like Canadian Islam is extremely diverse because it kind of represents indigenous formations, but also diasporic formations from everywhere where Islam is represented. Many of the Muslim women in Canada are racialized women as well. And this is an extremely intense and interesting plural community that still waits to have its full representation on screen. So we can expand that conversation.
Thank you so much, Dilyana. I know, like, here we're mainly talking about, you know, fictionalized, you know, stories, but I just wanted to kind of throw in the idea of reality TV. Again, I know that's not our main point here, but I'm asking that because it's been debated what, you know, representation in that space looks like, and whether it's harmful, whether it's reflective, you know, or whether it's sort of representative of entire communities. And the question I kind of wanted to pose this to everyone, you know, is how can we kind of, you know, have deeper considerations of like race, gender, class, sexuality, or bring an intersectional feminist lens to viewing something, you know, like reality TV that is supposed to be, you know, real experiences of real people reflecting, you know, supposed to be reflecting real people's lived experiences. I'm really curious about that.
Well, I can start this one because I am a reality TV scholar. That is my main focus. And I definitely think that we should be thinking deeply about these things. I think a lot of people view reality TV as something that is sort of like frivolous, light entertainment, but we do see a lot of these ideological messages circulating here. And I think that it is important to critique that it's not necessarily just fully self-representation that we are seeing, because things like the editing or producer interference that is happening behind the scenes is going to shape how we view particular people. And so, for example, like a study of American reality TV has showed that both Black men and women are overrepresented in terms of verbal aggression on competitive reality TV shows, in terms of like the percentage of Black men and women in these shows compared to contestants of other racial groups, and then, yeah, instigating fights and using negative language towards other contestants. So I think that we shouldn't just look at it as we're just viewing an unmediated version of reality. We should really consider what is shaping how these people are presented and how they are allowed or not allowed to present themselves. So I think reality TV, I think it's obviously contentious if it is real or not. I think what we're seeing is sort of authentic reactions to being put into a contrived situation a lot of the time. But a lot of those reactions are still mediated by the fact that people know they're being watched, and they know that there is, especially if they are from a marginalized group, there's a burden on them to represent their entire group and not just themselves as an individual. So yeah, I think it's important to turn these questions to reality TV as well, even if we think it's kind of silly, light entertainment. I think it actually tells us a lot about cultural values.
I actually agree as well. And it's unfortunate that I don't have any Canadian examples. The only example I can think of is in the UK. I think it's the Love is Blind series with Yewande, and she was a dark-skinned girl that was basically like every other girl there. They were basically recruited based on their appearance and things like that. And the media response to her was a lot different than her white counterparts. She was a lot of things were projected onto her, and even though she was very gentle and the way she was presented was very much the antithesis of what Clementine was talking about, there was still a lot of this projections again that she was aggressive and she was not necessarily attractive despite her fitting all the quote unquote Western ideals in terms of she was thin and she had the hair that was considered good hair, which is a different conversation. But yeah, it definitely affects media representation, reality TV, and I think they're closely linked because reality is not really reality, but yeah.
I like Clementine's point that, I think most attention is focused on news, on current affairs programs. You can almost see through the mediation process, right? Because if you do a little bit of media literacy, if you do a course online, it's easy to spot those, right? That, for example, a report on the trackers in Ottawa, you can almost see that there's a particular spin to this media outlet and how they are reporting. But when it comes to reality TV, because your guard is down, you're being entertained, you're almost, not that you're not at your most critical, but you are relaxed, you are enjoying this, you're soaking this in. And I think that's the most almost dangerous, because you start absorbing these ways of looking at yourself, viewing and thinking about yourself, and also looking at other people. And so I think it is also important, although it's we can talk about, fiction, but also to critically look at the implications of representations in reality TV.
Thank you for that, Selina. I guess my final question is one that I again want to throw open to everyone here. How can research help improve the depiction of Black, Indigenous, Asian women of color on the screen?
I'll go first. This question is like very near and dear to my heart, because I'm currently offering a series of workshops with my students on something that we call the academic screenplay. And basically the idea is to provide spaces for students to create their own stories for screens using the knowledge and the insights from the theoretical training that they have in media arts and in humanities. So basically taking seriously feminism, gender studies theories, critical race theory, Orientalism and trying to dismantle Orientalism, all those things, like taking seriously, this kind of critique and bringing it into the kind of storytelling that they're doing. And it's a responsible storytelling for screens. So one of the ways in which this works is through articulating where we're positioned as storytellers, whether we belong to the community, whether we're outside of the community, what are the ethical implications of telling stories from as observers, as outsiders, whether we have done ethnographic research with the community, all those kinds of things that are the backbone of critical analytical work in the humanities I ask my students to like literally translate it into practices of storytelling. This is what the academia can contribute, I think, like bringing more conscious, more ethical, more engaged and very passionate young people into the screen profession, regardless of whether they want to occupy space at the writer's room, at the director's room space, as researchers, just being open and self-critical as well.
I completely agree with Dr. Dilyana. That is so important. And the idea that I had prior to this was about perhaps policy consultation. That's how research can contribute to diversity and inclusion, especially of women of color and Black and Indigenous women, because the diversity reports that the CRTC receives is clearly not enough, and maybe they can consult research, academic research, in order to figure out what next steps are, what the workable steps are, and what is actually realistic to achieve. And that is one of the thoughts that was running through my mind, and that may be harder to implement considering that it involves the government, which is a slow-moving vehicle. But I think that is also an important avenue to pursue.
I definitely agree that like building a bridge between academia and industry is really important, because right now there's kind of a lot of stratification where the research that we are doing on representation and why it matters is not necessarily being relayed to the people who are making decisions in industry and in government. So I think that creating more connection and bridging that gap is really important. I also think that for people who are making screen content, it's just important to understand things like how different stereotypes operate. And I think that there's so much research on that it's like, it's all available. So maybe it would be really helpful if you would read some of it. And another thing I think is just understanding the broader context more generally. So the landscape in which we are making films and television, but also like the history of Canada in general. Like I think that reckoning with the colonial history of Canada is really important if we want to meaningfully change and increase and improve the quality of representations that we're seeing. So understanding, for example, when we're looking at Indigenous representation, we need to look at that history and that is still ongoing and informing the way that Indigenous people are treated today. So yeah, I think having like a broader understanding of what is going on outside of just the industry is really key if we want to make real changes.
To add on to what everyone brilliantly has articulated, I'm currently working on a project with colleagues to co-edit a book on decolonizing media and communication studies curricula and pedagogies. So I think it is important to be deliberate as academics, to use research to inform curricula, to be deliberate. I consider myself as an academic activist. So I'm not only an instructor, I have an agenda. I have an agenda to, translate some of the findings from my research and research of colleagues like Dilyana and others, and Clementine and Simi, into infuse it into the curriculum so that, this becomes part and parcel of the training. And to have, collaborations between, organizations and foundations that, producers and journalists belong to kind of have this ongoing capacity building, maybe discussions, conversations, and maybe reflexive conversations around how are we doing? What do we need to change? So I think research can feed into a lot of spaces, and it can definitely, it shouldn't remain in, you know, the so-called ivory tower and result in journal publications, and which is important. I think that is important. Knowledge creation is important, but I think at some level, like everyone else has said, that needs to translate into, you know, actual curricula, actual, you know, equipping the people who are going to be doing this work, and you know, giving policymakers, you know, evidence to work with when they do decide on policies.
Thank you so much for answering that question and for answering all the other ones that I've posed today. It's been so wonderful having you all here share your expertise. And thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to the Reelworld Screen Institute for having us here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ashley, for such a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.